Hey, FlimsyLunchTray here with you today, and we are continuing on our How to Map series and looking at the map Big Race. So we had part 1 2 weeks ago, and part 1 is we just look at the map as a whole. We discuss key areas, we look at islands, so on and so forth, discuss the tiers that you'll find on this match with ships, and so forth. So in part 2, as in traditional in our How to Map series, we're going to be looking at aircraft carriers, and then we go down to battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and the following parts. So in talking about aircraft carriers today, we are going to be looking at two things. First, we're going to be talking about typical aircraft carrier positioning for the map Big Race. And then secondly, how do aircraft carriers interact with other classes on the map? So, as is classic tradition, the first thing that I always want to highlight and emphasize in part 2, since we are discussing aircraft carriers, is that as an aircraft carrier player, in between your flights, or you're flying to your next target, on this map it's not as big as the higher tier maps you'll find. But let's say you've got roughly 10, 15, 20 seconds, maybe more depending on where you're positioned at on the map, before you reach your next, your target that you're looking to drop on. This means that you theoretically should have all the time in the world to be able to observe your mini map and also what's happening on the map. You should have work on your situational awareness as a carrier player. For those of you who like playing carriers, there's too often I see carrier players, not just for this map in particular, but other maps, where a carrier player will just be sitting behind on a flank that has no longer any allies on, and he's still sitting there. Enemy team comes through, pushes in, and kills the carrier player because he wasn't paying attention to his mini map or just seeing what was happening during the course of the battle. So you need to be aware of what's happening as a carrier player to secure, to safeguard the health pool of your ship. So with that being said, we are going to look at positioning first. So when it comes to this map, there's a few typical positions you'll find. And note that we are going to be talking about tier 4 aircraft carriers, because that's the only tier of carrier that you will find on this map. So first off, you basically here, they're giving you an image of what would be a domination mode, so 3 caps. Typically you'll have standard battle on this map, so it's something like it's something like that, give or take. It's probably actually a little bit bigger on this one. I can't quite remember, but it's something like this. Is if you don't get this game mode, you'll typically find yourself standard battle and sometimes epicenter with rings in the center. But for the first position, we'll talk about the allied team here on the map. The first position you have basically is spawn, right? You have a lot of aircraft carrier players who don't tend to leave this general area. They just tend to stay in the spawn zone. Granted, this is kind of like in a random battle, you would have 12. And so sometimes you can get double aircraft carrier on this match. So let's just say that I'm actually going to erase the circle. So you can have the position of here, and then sometimes you can spawn like over here. So these are the two. This is the typical first position for an aircraft carrier on this map. And then you will have position 2, which I would phrase is being down in this area. As I discussed in part 1 a little bit when we were going around the map, sometimes you'll have aircraft carrier players who will actually just literally go down to the corner here. Some will kind of position themselves facing forward along this island, so if they need to get away, they can take off, you know, relatively quickly. So yeah, this position 2 here, because this map is, it's symmetrical from a northwest southeast perspective if you cut a line diagonally across, but it is not symmetrical in the sense if you were to cut it from looking from the northeast to southwest perspective, if you drew a line like right through here. A lot of carrier players tend to drift more this way because you have this island mass here, and because how this map is so short, it's not so short, it's rather small for its tier, you tend to detect enemy ships rather quickly. Like a battleship player or, you know, a destroyer player is going up here, you know, you might get up to here and all of a sudden you're already detecting the enemy battleship over here. So carrier players tend to play more on the back part of the map versus a more forward position. So you have a typical spawning position. You'll have this number 2 position here. These are okay. The position I'm going to not recommend to you, I guess I'm going to be calling position 3. I've seen aircraft carrier players do this, and sorry about that, as my phone goes off. And that is, they go down to the corner of the map. They go down here. Oh, I'm trying to. I think part of the reason why you will find this is it's the first time, you know, it's carriers, it's your first time getting at tier 4. So you're going to have a lot of inexperienced players at tier 4 with aircraft carriers who are just starting out on them. At the same time, you also have seal clubbers. I have one in particular in my clan who loves playing the host show at tier 4. He wouldn't position at this number 3 position, but sometimes you'll find aircraft carrier players who will go down to the very bottom corner of this map, or, you know, for the enemy team, the top left, so that'd be like A1 up here. I don't know why, but it, like I said, it's just part of inexperience and just starting new things out, because I've killed plenty of aircraft carrier players down here. And at the same time, I don't know how much I recommend this position. This position, you're a little bit closer to what's happening here versus all the way back here. So I don't view it as bad. So you have these 3 positions. A 4th position is basically just once you have a feel for what your team is doing and how the battle's progressing, you move with your strong flank. Now, granted, again, because this map is rather small, your detectability is you can get detected pretty quickly as an aircraft carrier player on this map. So really, from my experience and what I see a lot of other players doing, is that I don't know if I can say I've ever seen an aircraft carrier player go across this line. The same I could say as for here. I don't think I've ever seen an aircraft carrier from either allied team, enemy team, ever really cross this line in my time of playing World of Warships and playing in the map Big Race. And that is because, like I said, because the map's so small, as soon as you get more out here in this open area, you can be screwed really quickly as an aircraft carrier player. So maybe as the battle's progressing and your team, let's say they're running on the right flank, and say you sat and spawned, you've been kind of waiting to see what's happening as the battle progresses, then you move, let's say, to this location. And then you have this island cover. If the enemy team does come around this flank, you have this nice big island to give you more cover and move up if you need to move further away. And the same could be said, let's say your team's winning on this flank, and there's not many enemy ships left. Then maybe you move, you know, say you're over here, you move more to this area, as that is a very oddly drawn arrow. And I erase my gray line. Yeah, so I just don't really ever see aircraft carrier players crossing these gray lines. So I think that's for a reason, like I've said. when we look at the enemy team here, you have, like I said, you have kind of your position 1, where the aircraft carrier is currently is, and then I think also over here roughly, somewhere in this vicinity. Sometimes, like usually, because this would be maybe you have aircraft carrier more over here, then one more over here positioned. You'd have your position 2, I would say, being more down over in this area. So I've seen aircraft carrier players in this corner, like I've over here, and then I've also seen some who've pulled up nicely along here with the the bow of the ship facing forward. Aircraft take off and fly over the island. They're right in the action versus sitting back in the corner and facing bow away. It's not good for you. And as I've also said, then you sometimes also have the 3rd position, which I don't recommend. Being back here, you just put yourself out of the fight when you're back here, and it takes your planes aren't fast like once you get more up to the higher tiered aircraft carriers, so your impact on the battle is drastically reduced when you're fighting from these 2 corners. And as I said, as maybe the battle progresses, you feel more comfortable, you can move up to something like this, a more forward position. And then here I wouldn't say kind of like, here we have like, this kind of area, because when you move up here, you're already showing side through these different channels, windows. So really it's kind of maybe if you did want to move up to here, and I would only really recommend this, these more forward positions, 1, that your team has won the flank that you're moving your aircraft carrier towards, and then 2 is that there are less enemy ships than your team. Like your team has the majority ships, so they have a stronger presence on the map. Because when you move more of these forward positions, you just put yourself at risk. So this is the typical carrier positioning that I find on Big Race. I might not play aircraft carriers a lot, which I don't. I had most of my experience in aircraft carriers at tiers 4 and 6, a little bit at tier 8. But when I've played on this map, and even when I'm not aircraft carrier and I see other players playing, this is what I'll see. I see the good positions and I see the bad positions. So 1 and 2, good. 3, bad. The forward positions, like I said, only when your team has won that flank that you move your aircraft carrier towards. And 2, that really it helps. It's best that your team has the majority of ships versus the enemy team. And I guess you probably could throw a 3rd thing in there. You don't want to just stay here, if the enemy team's just rolling through and you're aware of that early enough, then maybe you're just moving up along this line. So so you want to stay with your team, because you don't want to be stranded and isolated and alone, because that means if a destroyer cruiser comes through and they're able to kill you in the back because you have no cover. So move with your team when appropriate. That's how I'll phrase that one. So let's talk about how aircraft carriers interact with other ship classes on this map. So I'm gonna erase these forward lines, but I am going to leave the gray lines up for right now. So let's talk about how, like I said, aircraft carriers interact with other enemy aircraft carriers. I don't, at the lower tiers, this being tier 4, I don't tend to see aircraft carrier players going for each other's carrier because there's such a distance to travel. You don't have the most fastest planes at this tier, and at that same time, this isn't one of the biggest maps, it's one of the smaller maps. I don't see that happen too often because also at tier 4 you don't get fighter aircraft where you can drop fighter coverage maybe on your destroyers, or you're trying to spot a enemy destroyer and you just want to drop fighters on them. You don't get that at tier 4. unless Wargaming decides to change that later, as I record this during update 0.10.4. But yeah, so the typical flight paths you'll have, of course, really it's just kind of, it's focused along these lines of, let's use orange. You tend to have these flight trajectories that go more or less through here. Because you notice this because one is that, ships will play along these islands, these island areas. So, maybe I could actually, maybe I should draw more of a circle zone. Kind of arcing the islands. Yeah, and then you kind of have a little bit of action going on here. So it's mostly a lot of aircraft carriers, players, planes. You're going to be focused more flying around these areas, so that's where you're going to run into planes. So as an aircraft carrier player, you really don't deal with the enemy carrier, but this is where the planes typically come to be, and you don't have to worry about fighters. So really, it's not a big deal with how carriers interact with enemy carriers at this tier for the map Big Race. Now, let's just erase that for the brief time. When it comes to aircraft carriers interacting with battleships. Battleships, again, because we're at lower tier, sometimes you have players who are inexperienced and they do some things that don't always make sense. I mean, you could even say that at tier 10. But more notably so, I would say at the lower tiers, because a lot of players are still trying to figure things out, for those who are newer to the game. But most battleships players tend to... They'll work more along... Let's take this away. So let's say the enemy team, battleships. Like in this position, they kind of work more along the lines of this. Because part of the problem is once you get to this, I'll call it a kill box. Like, this is a kill box, and then this is a kill box for battleships. So a lot of battleships, as an aircraft carrier player, most battleships won't push very far into these kill zones. They would rather try to avoid, go around versus going into these, because once you're out in the open, you can get a lot of spam from cruisers, destroyers, torpedoes. You get the works. It's just bad. So you yourself tend to not have much of a threat from battleships themselves when it comes to their main battery, of course, because you tend to be more in these positions 1 and 2. And the battleships at these tiers, I'm trying to remember what I said, what tiers play this map. Is it tiers 3 through 5? I have to look at part 1. I can maybe edit it in and say what it is. You don't have a lot of range on your guns at the lower tiers. So as a result, you're pretty safe. I mean, if a battleship has made it all the way through, and then all of a sudden he's back here in the spawn area, something has terribly gone wrong. So most times battleship players will hang more towards the back and along these edges. So you don't tend to be in much of a health threat directly when it comes to battleships. Normally, if you're, as an aircraft carrier player, if you're at threat from an enemy battleship, it means that a flank has collapsed, your team's losing, and they've been able to push through into these kill zones, kill boxes, and past them, making you vulnerable in your spawn area. Cruisers, it's really the same thing, I guess. I could have just left those boxes up. These are kill boxes. It's just bad news. So as a cruiser, most cruisers, if they're like how I emphasized in part 1, when you look at these islands, you can see just even from this that the elevation of these islands is very high in the center, right? You really pretty much see that on most all these islands. And then all these islands, they taper off all around the edges. And it means basically on any of these islands, a cruiser can just kind of park and they can fire over the islands. So you'll find that experienced cruiser players will be utilizing the islands with their positioning, and that they'll also island hop. So they'll use the islands as they progress up, through into a map. Because if they get caught out in the open, you have the battleships that are, kind of stationary along these lines, and they're looking to obliterate a cruiser when they get the opportunity. Cruisers will tend to avoid these kill boxes unless you're inexperienced and just yellowing in. So as an aircraft carrier player, most of the time you'll find cruisers outside of these kill boxes. So we're talking, I'll just draw a line in the area, through there, through here, as well as, kind of through here. So just think of the lines as where the cruisers are present at. So you can kind of see there's this general avoidance of the kill box. Players do this unconsciously. They don't realize that they're actually avoiding these areas intentionally. But that's just the nature because of this open area. You get caught out, and then this just being the death zone, particularly with destroyers. So when it comes to cruisers, sometimes they can have the maneuverability, the stealth, if your team's not very strong on the flank, to be able to move up and then catch you outright. But it tends to be destroyers, I would say, probably pose the biggest threat to aircraft carrier players on this map. That is because, maybe for several reasons, but I can only really think that the first one in my mind is that a destroyer player who's experienced well and can outplay enemy destroyers on their flank, they can break through. So, for example, like you have this kill box, the one that my clan and many other players, it's just the death zone. If you're not a destroyer, you really don't go into it. Cruiser players try to support their destroyer players outside this kill box zone. And so actually, when we redraw this a little bit, because it's not quite far back. But when you have destroyer players who will go in through here, they fight other destroyers, they can win. And then if they win on the flank and you say you don't even have cruisers that are on your team that are paying attention here, that enemy destroyer can push through, and then he can just break out. So it's like when a destroyer is able to break through, kind of, let's just say, I'll draw red lines. I don't tend to notice too many destroyer players coming around this flank, but sometimes it does happen. But once a destroyer player is able to break through your team's lines, and then he gets back through here, he's a major pain. He's a really nuisance because he really distracts your team if they are paying attention to try to deal with the threat. And because destroyer players can just use their concealment and they get back in here and they can really cause a lot of hassle. And that is why position 2 is dangerous when it comes to destroyers who break out through these danger zones. I don't know how to better phrase it. Because if you're in position 2 and a destroyer player breaks through here, like, you're screwed, because he has the maneuverability, he has speed, he's faster than you, and he just cruises on down, torpedoes you, kills you, and you're not able to do much as a carrier player. So that's why you have to be paying attention, particularly what's happening in this kill zone, in this kill box, because if things fall apart for your team and you move to position number 2 at the start of the match and your team just collapses in here, you gotta run. You gotta scram, you gotta run back. Go this way, or just get out of there. Because the same thing, as I said, applies towards over here as well. If you're able to break through, you get around, bam. An enemy carrier in position number 2, he's yours. You own him. Like, he's not getting away from you. The only way that a carrier player in position 2 is really gonna get out of this position, I guess there's two things. One is if the destroyer player just got lucky and he's really poor player, and he dies. You're able to kill him. Maybe he took lost a lot of health in getting through this kill zone, this kill box back to you. Or second is help from your team. That's the only two things that's really going to save your bacon in this position number 2. So that's why it's important to be paying attention to your mini map as you fly over. Even if you say you're in this position 2, what's happening in the kill box? Is it benefiting your team, or is it, oh, the enemy team's gaining strength here? Then you gotta run. So that's one of the first big problems with position number 2 is just being able to break out and getting into this back zone. And at the same time, destroyer players can just sneak through easily. Really, it's mostly through this is where most destroyer players sneak through, but you know, if the enemy team is like not present, like let's say the allied team's not very present here, I've been a destroyer player I've snuck through here, I've snuck through here even at times, depending on the team's presence and where they're at on the map. Because as a destroyer player, you have a lot of islands to play off of, and utilizing your concealment. That's why this area is nice to break through to get into the back, because you know, you have these. Yeah, that's the island, but you have these 3. You can come along here, hug the island, come around, surprise the enemy carrier, or if you're going for like their cap, you know, you just break right through here. All of a sudden, enemy destroyer is capping your base in standard battle right here. So destroyers tend to have a lot of strength, I would say. I'd say just overall in general, they pose the most threat on this map. Even if they're average or good, a good destroyer player can really have a big impact. So as an aircraft carrier player, you know, utilizing your rocket planes, and for those of you who are experienced with your torpedo bombers, destroyer players are really like the biggest threat to you as an aircraft carrier player on this map in Big Race. So yeah, so I really don't think I want to dive too much more into this when it comes to aircraft carrier players. I actually didn't think I'd be talking quite this long about aircraft carrier players or aircraft carriers on the map Big Race, just because it's a small map. It's pretty straightforward once you understand these 2 kill boxes that I've highlighted. That carrier players don't tend to go past these lines. And then thirdly, you know, the biggest threat that destroyers are, that if they break out back into these areas, it can be a really major pain for your team. So I think that's all I'm going to say for now. Next Monday, we'll look at part 3, which we'll be talking more about battleships in particular. So yeah, so if you liked today's video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe if you want to see more. And if you have already subscribed, thanks so much. Really appreciate growing the community here with you. If you have any questions or thoughts, drop them beneath in the comments. So until next time, take care.